Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Leslie. She's been around the Kennedy Center, was for a number of years, and worked with our South Africa program. Maybe I'll read this little blurb first and then say something a little more personal. Leslie Hadfield went to South Africa with a group field study in fall 2000 and also in fall 2002. She returned as the field facilitator. Hadfield is now a PhD student in African history at Michigan State University. She continues to study South Africa history and the Black Conscious Movement, as well as Xhosa, one of the most spoken languages in South Africa. She completed her BA in history at Utah State University in 2002. She had finished, and an MA in history at Ohio University, which has a strong African studies program. Her thesis was entitled, "We Salute a Hero of the Nation, the Place of Steve Biko in South Africa's History." Leslie is from Logan, Utah. And I remember how excited I was to hear when Leslie started working on the Steve Biko stuff. She was fortunate enough to make the connections, and she'll tell us more about it, with Steve Biko's widow. And she was an excellent field facilitator and an excellent student here at BYU, and we're really happy that she's been willing to come all this way back here to share with us her path. And we'll turn the time over to her now.
Thanks, Dave. I have benefited so much from the program here, and it's one of the things that I really like about the program is you can share a lot of personal things, and it's nice to be back at BYU too. Having a prayer to open the lecture is very different. I haven't had that for a while, so that's nice. And I'm hopefully we'll be able to share a few things, some personal things about what I've learned from my study abroad experiences, and then also where that has taken me in my studies. And I want to start off by explaining this phrase that I have up here. It's Ndiweli Milambo Enamagama. And in Xhosa, the language that I'm studying and that was spoken in the area that we were in, that literally means I have crossed rivers with names, or I have crossed famous rivers. And Nelson Mandela talks about this in his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, and talks about how this means to the Xhosa people that someone has traveled a long distance. They've crossed these famous rivers, and they've had a wide experience, and from that they've gained wisdom. And I feel that that really describes my experiences in South Africa, that I certainly have traveled a long ways, and I traveled around South Africa as well, and I certainly have had a wide experience, and hopefully I've gained some wisdom from that, and I'll be able to try and share some of that with you today. So first of all, I'll talk about what I learned, basically three things. I think what I learned personally, what I gained from my experiences, and then I'll go into my studies. Dave said something to us once, and I can't remember if we were in South Africa or here, but he said that these experiences help you get acquainted with the reality of other people's lives. And I think experiencing that has really helped me learn a lot about life and gain wisdom. And the first thing I want to talk about is what I learned about myself and how I grew personally from my experiences. I had this exposure to different situations and different peoples and different cultures, and I grew a lot in working with people and gained a lot of experience and confidence in interacting with people, a bunch of different people. My first research project in 2000 was on post-apartheid historical memory. And what I wanted to do was find out which of the different races in South Africa, how they viewed certain parts of their history, because South Africa had this history of white domination and segregation. I wanted to see if that affected the way the different races viewed history. So I was able to interview people from all racial groups and ages and education levels. If you don't know, South Africa has basically four main groups of people. There are white people, which is split up into Afrikaners. Those are Dutch descendants, and then English-speaking white South Africans. And then there are the Africans, or what they were formerly referred to as Bantu, but all of the African peoples. And then colored people, and that is the category that they use in South Africa to describe people of mixed race, and that's still accepted and used today. And then they have what they call Asian people, the people from India and other Asian countries that have settled. And actually, South Africa has the largest population of Indians outside of India. Still, I think that's true. So I was able to talk to all sorts of people when I was interviewing them for my project. I talked with a group of teenagers of all different races. I talked with Auntie Bops. She was a 96-year-old Afrikaner woman. I talked with Estelle, who was an Afrikaner 22-year-old. I talked to Ron and Loshini, these Indians who lived in East London, where we were, and Nolene Arends, who is a colored woman, and then as well as my different friends who were Xhosa. And I just want to add right now, too, that it's really great that I was able to do that as an undergraduate student, to be able to go out into the field, conduct my own research independently, talk to all these people, and learn how to interview people, which is very important with African history, that oral history component. And I gained a lot of research skills and experience through that. While I was there, I also worked with a woman in a local technical college and taught life skills classes. And I went with some of the other students to their programs. And I also, my first time there, looked at the environmental services of the East London municipality. And all of those things gave me this wide exposure to the world. And from that, I learned a lot. I saw poverty. I learned from the other students about community and international development, social work, working with street children, and then also in teaching life skills, I learned about AIDS education and then learned from the students that I worked with. So that was really great. And I was at the time interested in, I'd been working at Utah State on the grounds crew, very interested in how the municipality in East London did their own programs. And one thing that was really fun when I worked with them is I was able to prune a palm tree with a power pruner. I don't know if you've ever seen those, but it's got kind of a chainsaw at the end, and it has this long neck. And I mean, I would never have thought of even doing that in Utah, to be able to prune a palm tree with a power pruner. But also, I just felt like I gained a lot of knowledge about the world, and I had an opinion when I returned. About a year after I came back from my first trip, I remember seeing a picture, I think it must have been a Time magazine, one of those big magazines, and it was a picture of street children in Africa, and it was an article about AIDS. And I remember looking at that picture and thinking, that is so familiar. I know that. I have participated, even if it was just a little bit, in AIDS education, and I have an opinion about that, and I knew what they were talking about, and I knew what I thought about that. Also, I became much more aware of my surroundings. I think my sense of what was going around me was heightened. And I talked with Miriam Ellis. I don't know how many of you know her. She was also a student that went with me. We were talking afterwards how it was almost like we noticed smells more. And maybe we were just imagining things. Maybe we we're just noticing those people that had very strong perfumes or colognes on. But I think more seriously, I realized that I could learn from everyone, and I was always looking at what I could learn from other people. And I had numerous conversations with people who were giving me rides places, people I met on taxis, people that I saw that I worked with or with other people worked with, and I learned a lot from all of those people. But the most important thing that I think I took from my experiences in South Africa is that I learned to love people. I realized that there are millions of people in the world. Just so many people in different parts of our country, in different parts of the world. And I knew that I was an individual and that God was mindful of me. And when I went and saw these people, and I would often watch them and wonder about their lives and what they were going home to, what they did during the day, how their families were. And I realized that God knew them as well, just as he knew me, and that they were individuals. And that is one of the greatest things I took from there. And going back the second time as a student facilitator was a big part of that as well, because I went back and I saw that people's lives had continued even after I'd left. And it wasn't this exotic trip that I was going on and then returning to. It was, they had their daily normal lives there. And some of them were dealing with some very hard things. And to see them to continue and find joy in life really increased my admiration for the people of South Africa. So all of those exposures together helped me see what I would be interested in doing with my life. And I realized that I wanted to do something that would bless other people. And so I wanted to find a way that I could use my talents and opportunities to work to bless other people's lives. And that's kind of how I've gotten to this point where I'm a PhD student at Michigan State. So now I'm going to kind of talk about what I'm studying and how that has brought me, and how that started when I was in South Africa. My first introduction to Steve Biko was when I read the book Biko by Donald Woods. And Donald Woods was an editor of the Daily Dispatch, a newspaper in East London. And he was friends with Biko and was able to publicize his story. And actually, Donald Woods ended up fleeing South Africa. But I read the book. This is the picture of Steve Biko that is on the cover of the book. And I was taking a class in preparation to go to South Africa when I read this book. And Biko's ideas about race and the importance of a positive self-perception to the freedom of individuals and society really made sense to me. Basically, black consciousness, the ideology that he espoused, was that he wanted the black people of South Africa, the Africans as well as the Indians and the colored people, he grouped them as black, needed to be conscientized of their worth and abilities as a people. And when they did that, they would be able to rise up and free themselves from white oppression. Just to give you an idea more about black consciousness, Halela Manhu, who was the executive director of the Steve Biko Foundation about 1.5 years ago, he says that black consciousness, he explains it, stripped to their bare essence, Biko's ideas about black consciousness were about self-respect as the basis for respectful relations with others. And then Peter Jones, I was able to talk to him. He was an associate of Steve Biko. And he explained that black consciousness found where the triggers were. What were the things that were going to enable ordinary people, mothers and fathers, to move beyond their basic fears and recognize a sense of destiny that is far beyond the kind of limitations that were imposed by the apartheid society then, that try to all costs physical means to constrict people, constrict their minds, constrict them physically, separate them, and so on. And it was the black consciousness movement that found the philosophies, developed the methodologies, and the practice of how to break these things. And therefore, all oppressed people across the spectrum, in the African group sense, in the Indian group sense, in the colored group sense, were able to very successfully break those kind of false barriers. So that kind of gives you an idea of what this black consciousness movement was about. This is another picture of Steve Biko in a newspaper article that I had copied for part of my research. Tragically, Biko was killed in detention during a police interrogation in 1977. And this was a 1976 article. But he still had a great influence. My first time in South Africa, I didn't study the black consciousness movement or Biko. But I did see something that really stuck out in my mind. I was sitting at City Hall in East London, and there they have this Steve Biko statue, and I can never get a good picture of the front of the statue. I apologize for that, but you can kind of get an idea of what it looks like and where it is. And I was sitting at the hall, and I had basically this view of the statue. And I was sitting on this small wall, and there were tons of people around. There were people sitting on the wall. There were people going back and forth, taxis pulling up, dropping people off and speeding off, and people crossing the street. And amongst all these people, I saw this man across the street, and he started staggering across the street. And he was filthy. His clothes were dirty and torn. He had dreadlocks and matted hair, and he was carrying this huge bag of garbage. He was probably collecting it to get some money for it. And he staggered across the street, and I was watching him, hoping that he wasn't going to approach me, because here I was the only white person sitting at City Hall. And he walked, and he kind of fell on his knees right in front of the statue, and kind of bowed to it. And he was there for a few moments, and I was watching this, wondering what is going through his mind. Was he, like, paying his respects, praying to this man? I wondered what was going on. And then he eventually got up and walked around and then went on that grass and fell asleep on the grass. And this just really struck me. I wondered, what would Steve Biko think about this? And it was just sadly ironic to me to see this man who was drunk and destitute and probably almost incapable of taking care of himself going up to the statue in front of this person a statue of a person who taught self-respect, self-reliance, and moved people to become agents of change in their society. So this really stuck with me. And when I went back, I returned home from South Africa, and I was wondering what to do with this experience that I had had. I continued to study American history, but I focused more on African American history. And I studied Malcolm X a little bit more and decided that when I went back to South Africa as a student facilitator, that I wanted to really get into the Black consciousness movement and look at the legacy that Steve Biko left. And so that's what I did my second trip. That's what I focused on. And there's a measure of hard work and knowledge involved in research, but also there's an amount of serendipity. And I feel like my research really fell into my lap, and I was just in the right place at the right time. And maybe that's the blessings of being a facilitator. You have all these other things to deal with, so you get blessed in other ways. But I was in East London, not too far from King Williamstown, which is Biko's home, and then right there in East London where I could look at the Daily Dispatch archives. I also went back in 2002, which was the 25th anniversary of Biko's death. And so there were a lot of things in the newspapers. A lot of people were talking about him. There was even a commemorative stamp that came out. And then I found out that my host family knew Steve Biko. And here's a picture of what he would have looked like, him and his wife, Nsiki Biko, and one of their sons. That's what they would have looked like when my family knew them. And so I was able to meet his widow, Mrs. Nsiki Biko, and she ended up introducing me to the people of the Steve Biko Foundation, which she and her son had started. And they really impressed me. They were dedicated to their community and trying to improve them, improve the people, and they were putting the ideas that Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness Movement put forth into action. And here are just some pictures. This is at a debate competition. I actually took this picture 2 years ago. And they have a debate competition for the high school students to help encourage a culture of debate and to encourage students to do well in school. And here, let's see if I can get the pointer. That's Mrs. Biko right there, and her oldest son, Nkosinati, there, and then other people of the Steve Biko Foundation. And you can see here, they're one of the most famous pictures of Steve Biko. At the same event, I took this picture of another BYU student, Mercy Johnson, who worked with the Steve Biko Foundation, and T-shirts that the Ginsburg Youth Council wears. And the Ginsburg Youth Council is the Ginsburg is right next to King Williamstown, and the Youth Council is supported a lot by the Steve Biko Foundation. And you can see that on the back of the shirt it says that he is a united, economically self-sustaining, socially active, and health-conscious youth of Ginsburg. And that's their mission. So I just thought that was a neat picture there. The paper that I wrote for Chris Meek while I was there the second time ended up becoming a starting point for my thesis, which Dave read was entitled, "We Salute a Hero of the Nation, the Place of Steve Biko in South Africa's History," which I finished last June. And I was again blessed to have things fall into place for me when I went to Ohio University. They had the Summer Cooperative African Language Institute, or otherwise known as SCOLI, there during the summer between my years there, and I was able to learn Xhosa and have formal lessons. And then 2 days before the program ended, I was able to go to South Africa again because of the money that the department there had given me. And I was also connected to Peter Jones, who was a close associate of Steve Biko. And so I had a really good research trip there. And briefly, in my thesis, I examined how Steve Biko fits into academic and public discourses of South Africa's history. And I argued that written histories have focused on the ANC and political parties, understandably, but because of this, they do not fully or adequately address the Black consciousness movement. That was more than just politics, but also about action in the community. And I traced the way that different people have carried on this memory of Steve Biko or legacy of Steve Biko, and starting with right after his death, the newly formed political party, AZAPO, they were the ones to keep Steve Biko's name in the public discourse. And that was until 1990 when apartheid ended and society allowed more free expression and honoring of Black South African heroes. And since then, monuments have been built, including the statue, the Steve Biko statue in East London. And the Steve Biko Foundation was founded. I think that was 1998 is when the foundation was founded. And just to give you a little snippet from my thesis, I have a few pictures here. This is in the middle, Steve Biko's grave. And these two pictures I found in the newspaper archives. And they're both of Steve Biko's mother, and I thought they were very striking. Another historian of South Africa, David Bunn, he talks about graves as places to visit for those who are remembering the dead, and they're places where people can feel close to the spirit of the dead. So they have a lot of meaning, and certain graves are also treated as monuments because of that. He wrote, this sense of presence of the dead below may also come to be associated with the political role of the dead citizen living on in the memory of the public. For this reason, many historical important graves become re-embellished and elevated into monuments associated with the maintenance of civil society. So here, that's what's going on. We have a picture of Steve Biko's mother in 1992 in September, around the anniversary of his death. And other national AZAPO leaders, including the president of AZAPO at the time, attended the graveside services, and then they also held a rally nearby in a local hall. And this other photo on the right was taken in 1994. And here is Steve Biko's mother all alone with the grave that is not well kept. It's kind of symbolic of her lone efforts to maintain the memory of her son. And also symbolic of the way that another historian describes this ANC triumphalism in South African history, where everything leads to the winning of the ANC, the African National Congress, and that's Nelson Mandela's party. The article with this picture reported that Biko's mother visited the grave every year and said that the organization for which he died should do more, that would be AZAPO, as well as the new black government. In 1997, the 20th anniversary of Steve Biko's death, the city of King Williamstown actually built a Steve Biko Memorial Garden of Remembrance and upgraded the cemetery, and it's very nice now. So that could be partly because of what she did, but also it was a good timing, 20th anniversary of Steve Biko's death. So my thesis and learning about Steve Biko has really driven me in my studies, and now as a PhD student at Michigan State University, where I never actually thought I would find myself in a PhD program or at Michigan State, but I'm really happy to be there. And I plan to do a dissertation on the community development programs of the Black Consciousness Movement to address this gap that I see in the history that also can help address community development and international development issues in South Africa. And so I plan to do that, focusing on King Williamstown, where Steve Biko did a lot of his work. In conclusion, and then we can have questions, obviously my experiences in South Africa changed my life, and researching and learning from the people I learned to love led me to what I'm doing today. I chose history because I feel that it's a way that I can use my talents and opportunities to bless the lives of others. And I learned in South Africa that, yes, there are a lot of needs and a lot of problems there in that country, but the people there are very capable of dealing with those themselves, and they didn't need me necessarily. But I feel that I can do good in teaching others about African history here in America, in the States, and to help expand their minds and enrich their lives as mine has been enriched. And hopefully I can contribute to our understanding of South African history, and then that would lead to understanding South Africa today. And I'm still learning a lot, and I'm sure in the future there are many famous rivers for me to cross. So there's many adventures ahead of me. But I would just like to finish by thanking the International Studies program here at BYU for helping me get to where I am and having these great experiences. And it's open for any questions. Oh, I think there was one picture. This is the Biko's house, and they have refurbished it and repaired it and put a monument in the front. Just thought you might want to see that as well. So, thank you. Okay, Dave.
You have to repeat the question in order to record. Help me, because I'm ignorant about the history. Nelson Mandela, I'm sure you're quite familiar with his life and juxtaposed against Steve Biko. And there's sometimes been comparisons. I don't know, could you talk just a little bit about, did they have a relationship, and if Steve Biko would have survived, would he have played a significant part and role in today's South Africa?
So the question is to compare Nelson Mandela and Steve Biko. Did they have a relationship? And if Steve Biko would have survived, if he would have had a big part in South African politics or South Africa today. Well, one thing that was really remarkable about Steve Biko is that he was very young. He died at the age of 30, and he rose up to be this national leader. People from all over the world were trying to talk to him at such a young age. And this was about 1969 is when he and others organized the student organization SASO, which was a black student organization which kind of broke. And they were really instrumental in starting this break from kind of a conservative 1960s. Some people call it the silent decade, because that's when the South African government really cracked down, and I think it was now I'm going to get my dates mixed up. 1964, I think, was the Rivonia trial when Nelson Mandela was sentenced to prison. So Steve Biko was just growing up at that time, and he learned from the ANC and the PAC and the other political parties, but didn't necessarily have any association with Nelson Mandela at the time. I know Nelson Mandela talks about him a little bit in his autobiography, how they heard about him in prison. And so I think there definitely would have been a relationship afterwards. And also because Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness Movement weren't necessarily a political party movement. And they actually, when Steve Biko was arrested the last time before he was killed in prison, he was on his way back from trying to set up meetings with the different political parties so that they could work together. And so I think in that way they would have worked together because Steve Biko wasn't strictly part of one party. And I think Steve Biko definitely would have played a large role in South African politics. It was a huge mistake for the South African government to kill him. One thing that's interesting, in 1997 when Nelson Mandela dedicated the Steve Biko statue in East London, I'll just see if I can find that so you can see it. Some ANC people were not happy about the idea of having a Steve Biko statue because they thought that it was against the ANC, which is more afterwards, I think. The parties and the movement after Steve Biko's death did clash with the ANC. But Nelson Mandela, when he dedicated it, he encouraged everyone to unite. I think the title of the newspaper article was "Unite for Biko," and he talked about how Biko united the parties and that they should follow his example. So that's the best I can give there. Any others? Yes.
In your study of King Williamstown, can you give us some ideas of the types of changes and things that Biko was working on?
Yeah, he was going to school in Durban, and he was kicked out of school because of his supposed poor performance. He was very involved in politics there, and he started working with the black community programs there. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't repeat the question. The question was about the programs in King Williamstown and what he implemented there. Is that right? So he started working with the black community programs in Durban, and he was banned in 1973, a year later, and he had to go back to his hometown in King Williamstown. And there he started an Eastern Cape branch of the black community programs. And some of those programs included the most famous Zanampilo Clinic, which was a clinic located not too far from King Williamstown, but in the rural areas. And it was run by black doctors for those people in the areas because it was difficult for them to come into the town and also have to deal with the politics of the hospital there. And that was a very successful clinic. A lot of people in the community there talked to the Ginsburg Youth Council about how that clinic had helped them, how their daughter was born there. That was an example. They also started home industry projects, or they had a leather working factory. They started to help people gain skills and support themselves economically instead of relying on domestic service or other service positions that were serving the white government. He also started scholarship funds or bursaries, and so that people could go to college. Mostly, his most successful one with that was for the children of freedom fighters, or those children of those people who had been sent to prison. And so without their parents there, it was really difficult for them to have school fees. And so he started that. Those are some examples. Now today in King Williamstown, the Steve Biko Foundation is kind of building on that. They have a lot of different programs, and they really are focusing on the youth as well, as part of the legacy of the Black consciousness movement, really being part of the youth. But they also have school programs, like you saw the debate competition. They also have award ceremonies for a local high school. When I was there in 2004, they were piloting a program to help coordinate all of the people and agencies that were working on AIDS and AIDS education in the area so that they could all be working together to one goal. So those are some examples of things that they're doing. Julie?
South Africa, of course, has a long history of racial tension and racial problems that Steve Biko is addressing with his Black consciousness movement. As a student and as a white woman in your work in South Africa, have you ever felt that was part of the dynamic between you and the people you've been interviewing or working with? And if it was, how did you deal with that, or how did you address that?
Okay, so the question is, because of the racial tensions in South Africa between white and black people, has that affected my relationship with the people that I have interacted with and have helped me with my studies on Black consciousness? Well, I think Donald Woods was a good predecessor. I'm not saying I really follow in his footsteps or am at his level by any means, but he was white and did a lot for Steve Biko because of his newspaper connection and then publishing his book, and developed a good friendship with him. And part of that was that Steve Biko, one thing Donald Woods writes in his book is that he never felt conscious of his race when he was in Steve Biko's presence, that he felt like he could just Steve Biko was comfortable with who he was, and that made him comfortable with who he was, who Donald Woods was. And because of that, they kind of forgot those barriers. So because of Donald Woods' I think, example that showed that black people, the people of the Black Consciousness movement had an exclusively black organization, but they didn't necessarily say that white people were all evil and they needed to be kicked out of the country. They just wanted, I'm paraphrasing this statement, but they wanted to wipe the table clean and then set it up in an African way and then talk. The first time I met Mrs. Biko, she was very kind, and she's a very gentle woman, very, very soft-spoken and gentle. And when I went to the Steve Biko Foundation the first time, she had gotten me in touch with them, and I met them and the Ginsberg Youth Council. They were out on the porch, and I had talked to them. They had told me about what they were doing, what Black consciousness was about. And one guy said, "So what do you think about white consciousness?" And I thought, well, I've never thought of that before, probably because I never had to, because of my position. And so they kind of challenged me that way. But I told them why I thought Steve Biko could offer many people something to think about and learn and build in their own selves. So other than that, I think they've been very welcoming, and I feel that they've been honest with me, that we've had a relationship where we've learned from each other. So, other questions? Yes.
I may have missed this at the beginning. I was a couple minutes late. I'm sorry, but could you talk about the significance of the title of your lecture today, maybe how that relates to both your journey and Biko's?
Right. Yeah, that was the first thing. So sorry you missed that. No, it means, the phrase means, literally translated from Xhosa, I have crossed famous rivers, and they use that to say that someone has traveled a long distance and had a wide experience and learned from that and gained wisdom from that. And it's something that I picked up from Nelson Mandela's autobiography, and I just have used it to show how much I've learned from my experiences in South Africa and where it's brought me today. So. Julie?
Sorry, Leslie, for so many questions.
That's fine.
When I was most recently in South Africa, I had a conversation with a woman who talked about how she felt that the youth were pretty apathetic about some of the serious social issues in South Africa, and also that she felt like they didn't have an idea about, I guess, the apartheid struggle, or people like Biko who gave their lives for, ideas like Black consciousness or the end of apartheid. In your work or in your studies or as you've interviewed people, especially youth, have you found that to be true?
Definitely the question was, thanks. The question was that Julia talked with someone in South Africa who had expressed concerns about apathy in the youth, who didn't know about the heroes of the past and Steve Biko, Black consciousness, and were not concerned about the social issues of the day. And definitely with the youth of the Ginsberg Youth Council or the Steve Biko Foundation, they are very committed. One guy who was the executive of the Ginsberg Youth Council, I don't know if he's that anymore, he had told me that he had read the book, a collection of Steve Biko's writings, 14 times. That was when I met him in 2002. So he's probably read it many times since then. And it's really a point of pride for their community, too, that they have this great leader from their community. And I think that's one reason why the Ginsberg Youth Council grew out of that community. So there are youth there, and they're really trying to inspire other youth groups. And there are some. I met someone who was starting a youth group in Mdantsane, a nearby township. But I think that there are a lot of people who don't know the history. I think there are a lot of youth who are apathetic, or with all the problems, they figure, well, what can I do? But hopefully there are enough youth out there. And just to go back to what Dave had said before about the similarities between Nelson Mandela and Steve Biko, it's interesting to look back in South Africa's history and see how youth movements have changed the history. And Nelson Mandela was part of the ANC Youth League, and they introduced the militant part of it later. And then there's the Black Consciousness Movement, and then the 1976 uprisings in Soweto, where the middle school and high school students took things into their own hands, and they really changed the course of history. So, yes?
I forgot what you said you were, or missed what you said your PhD, what you're studying for that, and if that's related with what you did in South Africa?
Yeah, the question was what was the PhD, what's my PhD now, and if it's related. I am studying South African history, and I am in the history department at Michigan State University. And I'm definitely following up on what I've done before. So, Julie.
Sorry, Leslie. I have another question. You spoke earlier about, I think your thesis for your master was about public and historical discourses, social discourses about Biko and how he fit into, the discourse of anti-apartheid stuff. But my question is, how do you see him still shaping public discourse, and in what ways do you think public discourse has an impact on some of the social issues in South Africa?
The question was, do I see Steve Biko still influencing the public discourse and how that has impacted society in South Africa? Yes, I think he is, and it's because mainly the people of the Steve Biko Foundation, and also because a lot of the ANC politicians today grew up in the 1970 period, and they call Steve Biko and Black consciousness their primary education in politics. So I think in that way, and I think that's one reason why the statue was built in 1997, because a lot of the people in the city council really did see him as a hero, and that's who they learned from. But also, the Steve Biko Foundation, they have every year a memorial lecture in September around the anniversary of his death, and they hold that in Cape Town. And they have very famous people come in. They had Chinua Achebe come. Nelson Mandela gave the last one. They've had other authors and scholars give these lectures, and they talk about the legacy of Steve Biko and what it means to today. And then more locally in the community, I saw it in a lot of these programs that the Steve Biko Foundation was doing. They were talking about Steve Biko as a hero, as an example of the students. This is what you need to be like. He did this. He entered debate in society, and that's where all of his writings come from. He's entering debate, and so that's why we're having this debate competition. They also have a youth conference around the June 16th, the anniversary of the Soweto uprisings, where they bring all the youth from the Eastern Cape, from different youth organizations, and it's the same thing, that this is what Steve Biko did, and this is what you need to be. You need to be a leader of today. So.
I had a conversation with a colored guy who was in Ginsburg before they split the townships into black and colored, and he talked about how Steve Biko would walk around Ginsburg with candy for the kids who were playing soccer, and he was one of the little kids who played soccer. And he said Steve Biko was such a, like everyone in the community knew him and loved him, even the little kids, because he would hand out candy all the time.
Yeah, Julie was just saying that she talked to a man who was one of the little kids that saw Steve Biko walking around the community. He would hand out kids. They knew him very well. And I found that too. Someone in the Ginsburg Youth Council was telling me a story about how his grandmother was on her way to the hospital, and I think he was driving with Donald Woods, and they stopped, and Steve Biko said, Mama, are you okay? Do you need help? And she said, I need to go to the hospital, and I don't have money to buy my groceries. So they took her to the hospital. And then the next day, he went and visited her and to see if she was okay and took her some food. So he was definitely a great example of what he was preaching. about time. So thank you.